Okay, good evening, everybody. I think we can make a start now. So thank you all for coming and welcome. And can I just start by thanking the two most significant of our funders that have made this evening possible: the Scottish Policy Forum and Baillie Gifford, both of whom I'm glad to see are represented with us this evening. And can I just briefly introduce the people that you'll be hearing from this evening before we move to discussion. So I'm going to work in reverse order and start with the last person that you'll be hearing from, Professor Graeme Roy, Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute, and it's their analytical capacity which underpins the work in the report, and they have been key partners in the production of this work. Graeme rejoined the Fraser of Allander, or perhaps went to the Fraser of Allander to breathe life back into it, might be an accurate description, in May 2016, after 8.5 years as a senior economic advisor and the head of the First Minister's policy unit in the Scottish Government. And I'm certainly in no position to cast aspersions about people, part of whose lives have been spent in the Scottish Government this evening. Next, Professor Josef Konvitz, and I'm particularly grateful to Josef for being with us, because he has literally flown halfway around the world to be with us this evening, coming here hotfoot from South Korea to participate in this evening. Josef is that relatively rare creature, an economist and academic of international standing, who also has a strong connection with and understanding of Scotland. So we are particularly privileged to have him here. He also spent 20 years in a succession of senior roles in the OECD, and as you will see when you open the report, OECD's work on international comparisons in this field sets the context for our ability to make the international comparisons, which are absolutely at the centre of this piece of work. So we could have no one more authoritative to help us with that international perspective. And finally, Jane Frances Kelly, Director of the David Hume Institute, who I think will take over and introduce herself and the report.
So thank you all for coming. When we started this off, we wanted to make a substantive contribution to the debate about the future of the Scottish economy. And I'll start by talking about why we took the approach that we did, and then just sort of take you through the main messages of the report. In the running order, I think I've written that I'll speak for 8 minutes. It's going to be 12. I've been overrunning. I was really struck that the debate about the Scottish economy tends to start and finish by comparing ourselves to the rest of the UK. And it reminded me of when in 2004 I moved to Australia and was talking to a couple of cabinet ministers in the Victorian state government. So Victoria is a state, 5 million population, which is a familiar sounding number for a population. It's a state that Melbourne is the main city in. And they were talking about how happy they were with Victoria's crime rates because they were the lowest mainland state for crime rates. Tasmania had overtaken them the previous year, so they couldn't say lowest Australian state anymore, it was the lowest mainland state. But the main thing for them was that they were ahead of New South Wales. And I, because I was completely new and fresh, I didn't really care at all what they were doing in New South Wales. I thought that Victoria's crime rates were something that should, they should be thinking about reducing them further. And I asked them whether they had looked at the international comparisons. And there's a survey called the United Nations International Crime Victimization Victims of Crime Survey that showed that Australia was actually one of the worst countries in the world to be a victim of crime. And I said to them, you publicly say, often you celebrate your kind of status as better than New South Wales constantly, but you're top of the class, but the class is at the bottom of the school. And so I was very struck when I came to Scotland, and all I heard about the Scottish economy was how we were relative to the rest of the UK. And so what we really wanted to do was there's a table tennis table next door, if that's what the noises are. We wanted to put Scottish productivity performance into an international context and diagnose the challenge, not just relative to England, but to the kind of economy that we should be aspiring to as an advanced nation. And to raise our expectations further, we took a look at 5 places which made a genuine difference to their economies, either as a whole or to one particular driver of productivity. And we wanted to tell evidence-based stories about how they did that. So, Scotland's productivity challenge. Can I invite you to turn to page 20? So figure 10, is it figures 10? Is it still figure 10? Yeah. Compared to the rest of the UK, which is the right-hand column, we don't look too bad. It's a bit of a mixed picture, but there are various places where we're doing better than the UK average. But relative to OECD averages, it looks much less good. It's well known that business investment in Scotland is relatively low as is R&D spending. Our international exports are lower than the OECD average and from a narrow base of industries and firms. One of the things that we are above average on is that we have a well-educated workforce. But it's not clear that we make the most of it because we have relatively low management quality and a lot of people working in smaller, lower productivity firms. And of course, recent declines in Scottish education survey scores, the SSLN, what does it stand for again? I knew I should write that down. Scottish Survey of Literacy and Numeracy. Yes. And PISA. What does PISA stand for?
International, it's a performance of international student achievement.
Yeah, sorry. I'm so sorry. That was like...
You caught me out. Don't ask me PIAC, that's harder.
And those are really worrying trends. And we have a shrinking working age population, and that means we don't have many options for raising living standards, so we do have to become more productive from this kind of base. So it is the case that it's very hard to increase productivity by large amounts, but the Scottish Policy Foundation macroeconomic model, which is operated by the Fraser of Allander Institute, that's my impression of operating a macroeconomic model, shows that even what one person called genuinely tiny increases can translate into big GDP numbers. And on the right-hand side, just opposite figure 10, there's one of the scenarios that we put through the Scottish Policy Foundation model, and there are others in boxes throughout the report. So then we thought we would take a look elsewhere at places that are reasonably comparable to Scotland, which have succeeded in turning around performance on productivity overall or in specific drivers of it. London, of course, couldn't be less like Scotland if it tried, but it is similar to Scotland in that it has schools and pupils that go to school. So it was that aspect of it we thought was important to take a look at. We're not saying that Scotland is like those places or should be like those places or indeed should adopt the economic approaches taken by those places. So we don't draw out separate sets of lessons from each case study, but rather we kind of tell the story of how it happened, where they started, how they ended up, and how they got there. And then the following chapter draws out a series of common lessons of success that we should be measuring ourselves against. So we took a look first at two very different models in Sweden and Ireland, so Sweden recovering from the crisis in the early 90s, and Ireland doing its catch-up. And then we took a look at what happened in Australia. I'm biased because I have an Australian passport, but it's an extraordinary story what happened with the huge amount of economic reform that was negotiated in Australia in the 80s and the 90s. They really transformed the economy to very effective ends. Then we were interested in taking a look at two particular drivers of productivity. The first was the OECD, we had noticed, had published, we've been on the phone to the author, in fact, in June, and they were publishing a couple of days later a report on regional productivity. And they said that the two things you really want is to have a large tradable sector, so sort of the importance of exports and so on. And the second thing was to have well-functioning cities. And we thought, well, where has done work on kind of making its sort of city economy work better? And so we took a look at Manchester and the experience there. And I worked in government in London in the early 2000s, and I remember well, it was regarded as intractable, the issue with London schools, where there was low performance, and now it's a completely different story. So given the declining education survey scores in Scotland, we couldn't not look at what had happened in London in terms of turning that around. So in terms of those common lessons, there were three things that came out really strongly. There was a really relentless focus on evidence, first to face up to the problem and to develop the response, and indeed in many cases to kind of monitor the kind of progress of going along. There was consensus and collaboration, not just across political parties, but also with business and trade unions, who developed, indeed negotiated a response together. And it was also notable that the role of business success was regarded in these places as self-evidently good for the country, that they had a role to play, and that trade unions and workers, labour, had to be part of the story as well, not just in order to kind of make the progress, but to have a better chance of being able to negotiate a decent distribution of the gains afterwards. And we found, and this was really interesting, that in all these places there were strong, credible institutions, I'm sitting next to one, independent of day-to-day politics, that command the confidence of people across the country and were able to hold decision makers to account. And in many cases, they really focused on developing those kinds of institutions. Even in Manchester, there's a family of them now. I think it's on page 46, worth taking a look at. The London example was obviously all about skills, but we found that a focus on skills came up in all the other examples too. And that focus on skills wasn't just about making sure that enough people went to university and so on, but focus on schools education and on further education, and in particular on training and retraining in the workplace. And that's really interesting, given that there's no consensus about how the economy is going to develop. There's no consensus about the pace of digitalization, the exact impact of automation or AI or international trade trends. But we found that focusing on skills would make us more adaptable to whatever happens, and importantly, increases people's opportunities so that they can exercise their agency better. So this isn't just a message for government, but for all Scottish politicians and business and trade unions. And it's true that this isn't easy. Productivity is a long-term game, and turning it around is something a whole country does, government, business, unions, others, by acting together. And there's no quick fixes, but it looks like there's some big prizes for the taking if we can get our act together. So that's what the report says, and I'm also really pleased with the cover.
Thank you, Jennifer. Joseph.
Well, first of all, thank you, John and Jane Francis, for inviting me to comment on the report, which I think is very timely. I've been asked to give something of an international perspective, which it makes sense, as you can hear my French accent and my OECD experience. So my focus is not really on Scotland. I'll let you draw the inferences from my remarks. But the first question that we would always ask at the OECD, and we would ask governments to ask of any policy that they want to adopt, is there a problem? What is the problem? And clearly with productivity, we're dealing with a mix of intangibles and tangibles, and especially of public goods, which have been probably a bit shortchanged in recent years, if not decades, and private goods. It's not just, the market just does not do the whole thing by itself. And so, since particularly the very slow recovery from 2008, people have been asking themselves, why has there been, in fact, a long-term decline in productivity, extending back well before the crisis? Are there deep structural causes, or is this simply an unusual coming together of many different variables? Robert Gordon has written most significantly about the long-term decline in innovation and R&D, particularly for cities as engines of the economy. But there are other people who will argue for other explanations. The fact is, there is a long-term decline in productivity. And this was featured in the IMF in a speech given by the managing director in April 2017, trying to draw attention worldwide to the problem of boosting productivity. We know that there are general factors, but even when you look at these factors in similar countries, there are different results. And some countries with relatively high productivity may still have significant problems, drags. That would be true of the United States. Other countries, such as the United Kingdom, which has had a very good record on employment, has had chronic low productivity, This is not a new phenomenon. And so we want to look at comparing internationally. It makes sense diagnostically. And my first point is that if the problems are there, and they've been known for a while, why, in so many cases, is nothing done about them? The OECD has been recommending for years and years to the United States to do something about health insurance. Dead letter. Korea gets recommendations year after year after year to do something to boost small and medium businesses to create the next wave of growth and employment. Recommendations to Germany about reducing barriers to the entry of educated and trained women for lifetime employment in the workforce. Nothing much happens. It's not our responsibility, it's the problem of the lender, you see. That's often what you get, is some kind of shifting around of decisions. And so the first point is people are complacent. It's not that bad. We've lived with it this long. We can live with it for longer. But once in a while, something happens to shake things up. And it may be, and very often is, from outside government pressure. And so I want to give you one example, of which I have quite a lot of experience myself professionally, something neutral, administrative simplification, red tape. Everybody complains about it. Very few countries actually have reasonable, sustainable plans to address it. The Dutch government came to such a turning in the road in the late 1990s, and if we look at what happened, it's rather instructive. First of all, outside pressure and a new coalition government. Very important was that cutting red tape became part of the coalition agreement. Therefore, it was binding on the members of the coalition for the duration of the parliament. They succeeded on the third try. There had been previous efforts at introducing a major reform that had failed. Very often the failure is enough once or twice to kill the appetite of the politicians. But it didn't happen in the Netherlands, so they succeeded on the third time. Measure it through a baseline so that they could see where they were and measure their progress. Doing it on a multi-level basis. And then they found that things weren't quite so simple because their communication of results was woefully inadequate. And this is something that comes up time after time after time. I've seen it with the UK as well. People think about the communication strategy at the end. It has to be done integrally from the very beginning. The Ministry of Finance in the Netherlands was reporting results on the Ministry of Finance website and then wanted to know why businessmen and civic organizations didn't reward the government and applaud the government for its progress. Well, who at 6 p.m. in the evening goes home and flicks on the Ministry of Finance website? Nobody, except people who work in the Ministry of Finance. So the communication strategy was awful, and that was one, that's just simply one takeaway, please. The second is that you get good results, but then you have to repeat and repeat and repeat, whatever it is. And the third, which comes from a major, not only from the Dutch example, but from other OECD work, and this I think is statistically shown, when several countries adopt a structural reform together, more or less together, they make more progress than any single country by itself. There is some mutual reinforcement, intangible, I can't explain it, but it's statistically there. Several countries introduce a reform together, they all get more out of it than individually. And that, I think, is definitely something that bears repeating in Scotland. So you go from complacency to courage, take it on again, maybe this time we'll succeed, and then competence at delivery. My next comment, though, is a little bit opposite to the examples in the report itself, which is to remind you that in each of these countries, there are still black spots. Sweden has regional disparities that are rather stubborn. Ireland neglects its infrastructure, particularly for transport. Australia has a relatively low rate of research and development, and then there are those famous state barriers and lots of different things. In the UK, probably an over-centralized urban policy and what seems to be a kind of national stalemate on housing. So countries that can succeed in one reform may nonetheless still have another agenda to pay attention to. The successes matter nonetheless. And that's that you're still better off for having achieved something, even if it puts pressure elsewhere in the system. Now, the examples that are in the report are, you could say, in living memory, but they're not spanking new. That's not a problem, but it does raise a question, which is anything different this time? And here I go back to the IMF report that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks to highlight what the IMF highlights. which is something I've written about extensively in my book as well, Cities in Crisis. The degree of uncertainty is intolerably high, and itself depresses investment in productivity-enhancing activities. And the degree of uncertainty here is obviously quite high. I need not explain more. But it's both specific and general, and to some extent measurable through surveys, reporting, and so on, and just simply watching what's happening in business investment. Finally, the report concludes with a question, open-ended, about, which I think is absolutely essential in a democracy, choosing the model. What future does Scotland want? What is its essential character? Here there's, the throwback though is the risk of path dependency, of thinking, well, we are what we are and it's too costly to change. And that's something that's partly in the mind, but it's partly there on the ground as well. And therefore, I would urge you to look at your comparative advantages. And on the grounds of institutions, something that I say time and time again, this country has huge capital in the quality of its governance. This is a society, a nation that has very, very high degree of integrity. And that is priceless in this world. You have the urban base, obviously, with your cities, particularly in the mid-country belt, high R&D, high levels of education. So build on those strengths and look at your untapped or underutilized assets. And I know you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Graeme.
Great. Thank you very much. And I also congratulate Jane Francis and the team on today's report. And also it's nice to see the Scottish Policy Foundation's model being used in anger for the first time. What I want to do is just give our reflections, bring it back down to the Scottish context and give our take on where we think Scottish productivity is at the moment, but also give some reflections on some of the key lessons that we take away from the report that might be quite useful to reflect on. I mean, the obvious thing is there's a debate about how we're doing with productivity in Scotland. Obviously today the Scottish Government's part of their response was to highlight how Scotland's productivity has caught up with the UK over the last decade, which is entirely correct. There's a number of caveats with that though. So firstly, one of the reasons why we have caught up in productivity with the rest of the UK is actually because we've created fewer jobs. Also, if you look at our productivity comparisons to the rest of the UK, one of the reasons we actually do relatively well is that we have sectors which are naturally higher productive based here in Scotland, so oil and gas, financial services, and if you actually look at a firm level of productivity, then we're lagging behind the UK. And as we know, the UK actually, in terms of productivity, as Joseph was saying in the report, is not exactly that, is not great to write home about. So Scotland is currently in the third quartile of productivity within the OECD. And now our students sometimes always ask us to try and say, well, look, can we try and give some real life examples and put that into context. I once tried it with this thing of saying that if you put Scotland's productivity performance into the context of Scottish football, then we would be the Arbroath of Scottish football. So, but that's an economist attempt at a joke. So before I see headlines, tomorrow in the Arbroath Advertiser claiming that Fraser of Allander has attacked Arbroath, and I apologise for that. But there's a serious point in there in that back in 2007, the Scottish Government had a target take Scotland out of the third quartile of productivity and be in the top quartile of productivity by 2017, i.e. last year. And we're still in the third quartile of productivity 10 years later, and that target has not been met. And we know that productivity doesn't just matter for economics, it doesn't just matter for prosperity, but it matters for wages, and of course that matters for taxation. And with the new powers of the Scottish Parliament, getting tax growth into the Scottish economy is absolutely fundamental, not just to our economy, but actually to the public services that we all depend on and rely on in the future. So I guess a couple of reflections from me in terms of the report and what we take away from that. I mean, I think the first thing, though, is, and I would congratulate the Scottish Government on this, is to say that they've made great strides to improve the quality of the data that we have in Scotland around productivity, but there are still massive gaps in there with our understanding about what are the genuine barriers to Scotland filling that gap. So we lack proper capital investment data, so we simply don't know what firms invest in Scotland, which then begs the question, well, do we know why they're not investing in Scotland? If we actually don't even have the data in the first place, it's difficult to answer some of these really basic questions. I think the second thing as well is we also need to realise that we inherit the economy that we have at the moment, and that has certain geographical, certain sectoral structures that in turn are important drivers of our productivity. So tourism, for example, is a highly successful sector in the Scottish economy, but it will naturally always have relatively low levels of productivity, and we need to have honest conversations about about what type of growth do we want to try and achieve, and actually a blanket one approach at all that we just go massively for productivity might not always suit sectors that we've got. Health and social care is another really good example of that, where the drive for productivity might have some unintended consequences that we might not always agree with. We also need to understand the structure of our business base in Scotland. So if you look at a lot of the data, we actually don't struggle to have really high productive top-end firms. We actually do quite well at that. Where we really struggle is in the overall average level of productivity across our business base. So what we call the kind of fat middle within the productivity distribution. And if we can shift that ever so slightly up, then we can have dramatic improvements in our productivity. Now, a lot of that is actually quite basic. So it's about levels of management quality in firms. It's about process innovation. It's about basic digital infrastructure, transport infrastructure. And I guess it needs an all kind of an encompassing approach to that. Third thing I would say about this is it'd be really good if we could move away from having silly targets, targeting to high-level things to be if we're going to be the best in the world at this, or we're in the top quartile and things like that. Don't help because they're completely unrealistic to make. They divert attention from the proper conversations we have about how we actually get there. Boosting Scotland's productivity is difficult, and high-level targets like that I don't think help all of that. And it does actually drive sometimes some unintended consequences, like that the be-all and end-all is faster productivity, when in certain sectors we might want to think about other types of outcomes rather than just higher levels of productivity. The fourth thing I'd say from the report, which is really interesting again as well, and this came through in Andrew Wilson's Growth Commissioner's report as well, looking at other countries, which is you can agree and disagree with the different types of models that different countries have. So you might say we want to be like Sweden, or we want to be like Ireland. And that's largely inconsequential, because what really matters is if you look at the experience of these countries, what they do is they pick something and they do it really, really well. So Ireland in the case of internationalisation, Sweden in terms of high-level innovation and domestic-based economies. But you've got to be honest, and that comes with consequences. So we heard about some of the challenges that Ireland face. Don't fall unwell in Ireland. Don't become homeless in Ireland. And there's some difficult choices you have to make. You can't be everything to everybody. And then the final point, I guess it's quite easy for me to stand up and give you a list of proposals I think would be really good for boosting Scotland's productivity, how to boost business investment and so on. But I think there's a really important, more general point there, whereas I don't think we do enough in Scotland about genuine hard evidence about what works. We don't have real significant evaluation about our various programs. You look through years of successive governments coming up with different initiatives, and do we genuinely know which ones are working, and do we genuinely know which ones are not working? We've been somewhat critical of the government in recent times, talking about this kind of cluttered landscape that we see on the kind of economic policy world in Scotland. That's not to say that we don't think they're all very good, but what we're saying is, well, do we actually know which ones work and which ones don't work? And in some ways, I'm quite pleased that the Scottish Government have seemingly listened to us about the proliferation of strategies, because I noticed in the programme for government we're having an economic action plan. So we're obviously moving away from strategies to now have something else, but there's a serious point in there, and if you look at, do we genuinely know what works? Small business bonus costs us £200 million a year. It's never been evaluated. It might be the best policy in the world, it might be the best thing about Scotland's productivity, but we don't know. And if we don't have a proper evaluation, then it's very difficult for us to know what works. But also, I'd argue it's also really difficult for us to be able to move away from things that don't work and help policymakers and politicians say, well, actually, we tried this, we thought this was a good idea, we've experimented with it, but it's not actually worked, and we'll go and try something different. So that's my tuppence worth for it, and I'll hand back to John.
Thanks, Graeme. Right. We have a little bit short of an hour now for questions and discussion, so I hope that means that everyone who wants to engage will get a chance to do so. But I'm mindful that the responses to any issues that people raise are likely to be quite rich. So I'll start by taking people's thoughts in twos to try to make sure that we get everybody in. Who wants to be part of the first wave?
Oh, and there are microphones coming.
Right, there are microphones, so please wait. So we'll take two together at the back, and I promise you'll be in the next round.
So after all that, what do we do next? What do we do when we go out the door? Do we turn left or right?
I'd just like to pick up one or 2 points from what Graeme had to say. I quite liked his point, which he also followed up on a little bit himself, where he noted that the Scottish Government had an aim of improving its position in the productivity league tables, and he noted later quite correctly that these kind of targets aren't all that useful or interesting unless you're doing a whole load of things to make them happen. If you simply announce a target because it sounds good, that's not all that clever, and I rather agree with his later comments on that. Secondly, though, I just want to mention one sector. He referred to what he regarded as a problem almost of tourism as being a sector that was inherently low productivity. And I'm not sure I totally agree with that. I'm not sure that in the longer term, in a modern dynamic Scottish economy, we should just be accepting almost without question that tourism is inherently a low-wage, low-productivity business. I think we need to be thinking it is an important business for Scotland. It pulls in a lot of money for Scotland, employs a lot of people. But it does seem to me that we need to be thinking of ways of boosting productivity in the area so that most of the people working in tourism and related sectors are not experiencing the chronically low wages that they often do at the moment. I've got one or two other points in mind, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to take first
Shall I
bite?
start with whether to go left or right? When we were being fitted with our microphones, we were asked where we were sitting up here, and John is on the far left, and Graeme's on the far right. I'm on the centre right, apparently. I'm usually centre left. It's really tempting to have finished a report like this with a list of actions for government at the end saying, these are your 10 steps. But what looking at places that had genuinely done this hard thing told us was that that's not what makes a difference from something, kind of someone sort of coming in and telling kind of what to do. And the kind of debate that you tend to get after that is people sort of saying, well, that's the wrong kind of action point or whatever. And the argument comes about that. I would sort of say that I think that we've some way to go in terms of understanding what our situation is and diagnosing it properly. The first step to recovery is to accept that there's a problem and understand the problem in terms of what the evidence says about it. And then, given that there are really big trade-offs with, as Graeme was saying, with what economic model the country might might adopt, it's not a surprise that these other places showed that what worked was when there was a level of consensus across political parties, business, and trade unions to make the way forward. So those kind of sort of things coming together to negotiate out what kind of approach they wanted to take, what kind of trade-offs they were willing to accept, and what kind of way forward is sort of the opposite of us kind of suggesting what the way forward should be, if you like. And so it was very deliberate, because it's what the evidence told us, that what has to happen is those different parts of Scotland coming together, and first of all accepting that there is an issue in the first place.
I'd like to comment on this question of how you get there. If it's not like a country's not like a business, but it's sometimes run with the logic that there must be fat out there. We can enhance productivity if we try to get people who work to do more without paying them more. Just simply put the squeeze on. They'll figure it out. I don't think it worked at Toyota to make it one of the world's largest automotive companies. But unfortunately, I think in the Anglo-American world, there is this logic that the people who work in government represent the fat somehow. And the real people aren't in government. And therefore you can cut, put on the fiscal squeeze, and you'll get a better performing government. It won't deliver reforms. Reforms actually cost. They cost. The administrative simplification reforms in every country that I know are expensive. Now, they may be cheap in the big scale of things, but to deliver them costs new money. And that's an additional money. It's not coming from something else. It's not a transfer. And I think this is partly why it has to be done in a kind of government way. You have to look at the budget. The question of tourism, well, tourism is a kind of a funny thing as a sector. It's both domestic and foreign. It's very difficult to count. It has some of the lowest wages and some of the highest wages. So it spans everything. Some of what gets done in tourism is not something that people think they're doing as part of the tourism industry. It's very hard to disaggregate. And if you look at governments, who gets the portfolio for tourism? And you get a sense of where political priorities are. And this is another area which takes investment. It's not just simply, oh, well, we'll have the landscape of Scotland, and I was here in May, and we love going in the Highlands, which is there, you know. That's not quite it for the world that we have today. You have to build more museums, new museums, modernize facilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that can be a much more spillover benefit for everybody.
Yeah, so on the specific point about tourism, so the point I'm making is that it's not that we can't boost productivity in tourism, that, you know, I fully accept the point that yes, you want to try and look at new ways to innovate in all industries and in all sectors. Because my general point is that if the be-all and end-all is a dash for productivity, you also need to reflect on the underlying basis of the sector you start with in the first place. So tourism is naturally going to be less productive than financial services or oil and gas. If we want to frack the life out of Falkirk and Grangemouth, that'd be brilliant for our productivity. But is it the best thing that we should do for our economy and our environment? Sustainable tourism, which creates jobs in remote local communities, that gives sustainable employment. And I accept, yes, you know, in many areas needs to improve wages. You know, why should that be looked at any differently or valued any less than economic activity somewhere else? So I guess my general point is, I accept that, yes, you need to improve productivity in places like tourism, but you've also got to accept that where they're coming from means that this dash of productivity has got to be viewed in the context.
Okay, we have the first participant in phase 1 here. For the convenience of the mic movers, we'll take the second one here, and I'll come to the middle in the third wave.
Thank you. My question really is about perhaps what I call political culture or mindset. I found it fascinating reading through the case studies in the report. And there were just a couple of themes that just came out to me as I was reading through them, which we've partly touched on already, but seemed to me to be really important. First of all, that this is a long-term game. Coming up with a productivity plan that's going to work in 3 years' time, by the time of the next election, is almost not worth even talking about. That unless you're in it, say initially for a 10-year period, and you do the research, you do the hard grafting, you find out the evidence, and you go through it, unless you're prepared to do that, it's almost not worth bothering because you're just kidding yourself. And the second issue, really, but again tied up with political culture, is I really noticed in the case studies the importance placed on bringing people together. Take it out of the day-to-day political cockpit of First Minister's questions. Instead, sit down with people across the political divide. Sit down with business leaders and maybe trade union officials as well, and talk people through the evidence and get people to have some kind of shared ownership. And I suppose the punchline is, I'm just not sure we're very good at that in Scotland yet. We need some help in how we can get better at doing those kind of things.
Could I say that I think your interpretation of productivity is a bit old-fashioned? And one way that you could increase productivity in Scotland is by reducing employment hours by a third, on the basis that using different work techniques and all the rest of it, if the people manage to do the same amount of work, in 25 hours as opposed to 35 hours, then that could have a very beneficial effect on work-life balance, on quality of life. It might not increase the total productivity or the results, the financial results of productivity for the nation, but I think it would actually probably produce a happier and potentially more productive country as well. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, I having worked about 90 hours last week, I couldn't agree more. But that's why in the very last page it kind of says, countries have choices that they have to make, right? There are trade-offs in all of these things between working hours and other things. So the French and the Americans have very different levels of productivity, but they work very different hours. And Singapore again works much higher hours. There are choices that need to be made, and those choices, in order to stick, have to be made by these different parts of society coming together. Yeah, I agree with the thing about kind of sort of reaching across political divides. I sometimes think those things can go in cycles in countries, when I kind of sort of get more depressed about the kind of topic, I kind of just keep remembering that the only thing that we can rely on are that things are going to change. Sorry, that's just some life advice there.
There are things I could comment on, but I wonder if we shouldn't have maybe another couple of questions, and it may make it easier to go back and forth.
Okay, the lady in the maroon dress there, and then there's a hand. I can't quite see who it's attached to, but in the row behind. Paul, yeah. And then we'll come over to that side of the room, I promise.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting report. You touch on quite a few things, and I like the talks, actually. You touch very relevant points. I just want to make a few additional points. One is that you're right that the factors of production as such, there are limitations to just looking at that physical or human capital. There's actually another issue which is structural. And that's one aspect which you touch upon in the report. I've just briefly glanced through it, I hadn't seen it. Those are the issues I think that are critical in this aspect. The other aspect is that we're talking about the next AI revolution, or you can call it, as Tunzelman called, the delayed industrial third revolution. So productivity is actually something that may start hitting as the exponential curve takes off. And third aspect, which also touches upon the cities, there's such a thing as smart cities, which in Holland and in the US and in Germany. And all these three things have one critical overlapping element, and that's firm structures. Firm structures in the UK have been declining since the 70s. So has productivity, actually. And if you look at UK, so I can't give Scottish figures, but UK has about 1/8 of the large firm density compared to the US. And if you look at R&D, it's much lower as well. But again, if you look at how much business invests in the US in R&D, when they have something like, I don't know exact figures, 2.5, out of that, nearly 2/3 of that is coming from business. And if you relate it back to businesses, it's again coming predominantly from your large firms. So the key thing, actually, if you have to look at Scotland, is Scotland has much lower large firm density. Secondly, you have to question the innovative small firms that came up, Fanduel, Skyscanner, got sold. They didn't last the distance. And if you look at why they didn't last the distance, because if you want large firms for higher productivity, there's a few questions of financing. Are we short of venture capital? Scotland seems to have a fifth lower than the UK average. Secondly, we have to say, is there a question of the entrepreneur? Can they not last the distance? And thirdly, independence of a firm seems to give that distance to make them grow. So these are all aspects that could change Scottish productivity if we address them.
You'll enjoy page 15.
Thank you. My question is partly related to that. I was sitting here thinking that this is very valuable, but it's necessarily looking at historical data. And there's a certain irony that we're sitting here in Codebase, yet there hasn't been any mention of the impact of use of data, digital technologies, and the debate on what artificial intelligence will do to the job market in any of the discussions so far. Scotland's just secured, or Edinburgh specifically, has just secured a very significant amount of government investment to support the growth of digital skills and digital capabilities. So I'd be interested in your views on how you see Scotland placed in that aspect, how important investment into that is in Scotland's choices, and how you think it may play a role in future productivity.
I'll just say so quickly. I did, the one context in which I did mention digitalisation, and it's no accident that we're here in Codebase, by the way, is that it is clearly going to be really important, but there really is no consensus on the pace of it and exactly what difference it will make. We do talk about it in the report, particularly in the context that given there's no consensus on how fast all that is going to happen, what exactly kind of difference it's going to make, it's like Brexit. People are sort of saying, well, haven't you done different Brexit scenarios? It's just like, what we've done is look at things that are going to be important however those things turn out. Another complete unknown is the development of international trade patterns and so on. But the focus on skills that we found in all these case studies really struck us in that context. And in particular, I mentioned that, you know, the importance of training and retraining. We quote there was a McKinsey report on productivity growth about 4 months ago, and the British offcut of it was published yesterday. They estimate that 60% of productivity boosting opportunities will come from digitalisation. And so, you know, therefore, training and retraining is really important. What else is really important about that is the standard of our education in schools. If there's no consensus on exactly what's going to happen, if we can equip ourselves to be adaptable, then that seems like the most sensible thing to do.
I'd like to comment on this line of discussion with a reflection just coming back from South Korea. South Korea, along with Israel, has the highest level of R&D as a percentage of the economy in the OECD. Like Israel, there are huge social disparities that are related to that. Large percentage of the population don't have the education, the skills, or the access into employment that allow them to participate in the evolving economy. In South Korea, the level of digital skills among people 55 and older is about 10%. The society is aging very rapidly. By 2050, it will catch up to Japan. To give you an order of magnitude, France, where I live, in 2050 will be in aging, where Japan is now. So some societies that are in this aging pattern, young people in Korea, highly educated, but they will need very different transitions as they mature than what is needed now for the people who are older, post-tertiary education, never went to university, etc. Gyeonggi province, which is on the northern side of metropolitan Seoul, and I should say lifelong learning is a national policy as well as a regional policy in Korea. Very few countries have national policies on lifelong learning. And there in the province, they want to have a learning center no further than a 10-minute walk from any place in the province. Walk, not ride, walk. That's very dense. And most of these are in publicly owned premises where there is space that can be used, particularly in the evenings or on the weekends. But they need a dynamic model to deal with people all across the spectrum. Another thing which I learned in Korea that I had no idea about, since 2010, because of the aging problem, they've massively opened up immigration. But 1.5 million non-Koreans now living legally and working in Korea. And about 7 million Koreans living and working or living abroad. And most of that growth in immigration is since 2010. And coupled with that is a huge increase in multicultural education in the primary and secondary schools. You have to see this as a sort of a comprehensive package. Now, Korea is a more homogeneous society. There is, I think, somewhat easier to develop a certain kind of consensus. One of the drivers in Korea, and I think it's also one of the drivers in Sweden, one of the drivers in Australia for sure, geography. You are where you are in the world. Nobody's going to help you. Australia is detached in a way, depends a bit on the US for defense, but it's on its own in this vast Asia-Pacific region. It had to do what it had to do. Sweden is the largest Nordic country, used to leading the others, but very much aware of its geographic isolation. Ireland as well. And Korea is, along with Switzerland, the most mountainous country in the OECD. Very little land that can be developed for urban or for agricultural purposes. They're stuck with it. And this is without dealing with any possible unification question. The first time I went to Korea in 1995, to get there, you had to fly from Europe all the way around the Korean peninsula because you couldn't fly over China. That added an hour and a half, but it gave you a scenic ride as you went all the way around by day the Korean peninsula. Well, those days are past, but that's globalization.
If you're
Tell us
stuck,
an
Graham,
anecdote.
can I prompt you to say something about firm
Yeah.
structure?
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, one of the really interesting things, if you look at the history of the Scottish economy over the last 20 years, is been that decline away from large firms, but in particular, and absolutely crucial, is headquartered firms in Scotland. So large number of firms taken over, large number of firms, when they grow up to that size, be sold and moved on. And that has a number of implications, but one of the big ones is what we think is that's one of the reasons why R&D, for example, tends to be lower amongst the business base in Scotland, because it tends to be the case that the functions like R&D sit and stick alongside where the big strategic decisions are taken, and that ultimately works against the Scottish business base. I mean, the one thing I would say about that, which has always puzzled me, given the institution that we come from, is just how we can be so good in the university sector and so good in academia and so good globally there, but then we seem to not be able to translate that in a genuine sense into what's happening in the business side of things. And I know things are moving in various institutions, and the example of Digital in Edinburgh is a really good example of that here, where you're generally starting to see universities potentially see their role in the economy a lot better. And I think we need to make more of our universities. The one good thing about universities is they can't move away. They can't be bought over and taken south to London or taken to the United States. They're stuck here, like it or not.
Okay, right, I can see two hands in a straight line here, so I'll take those first, and then I'll move further up that side of the room.
2 points. One is, you're talking about universities. We are very keen here in Britain to put everyone through university, and we tend to neglect the vocational side. If you look at Germany, they have a twin path where the vocational side is equally respected. In fact, in some cases, even more than a university education. As a result, they have some excellent engineers and craftspeople, and their productivity would put us to shame. Why are we accepting that the university is not the only solution? And the other point I'd make is, you were talking about tourism. But one of the advantages of a small country is specialization. Tourism is a huge amorphous blob, and yes, a lot of it is probably not particularly productive. However, Gleneagles and Blackpool are both in the tourism business, but I think in a very different way and with a very different spend per head. Likewise, Malaga and Monaco are in the tourism business, but again with a very different. No, Scotland can specialise, and so just having this broad brush, arena of tourism or any other industry, we could do a lot better by specialisation, surely.
Diagonally straight back.
Thank you. Stephen Watson, mathematician with an interest in macroeconomics and research and innovation in particular. There's many points that have come up which I could speak to. So the audience is large, I won't. So I'm just going to pick on two. One relates to research and innovation. So especially the point that was made there, the mystery of perhaps why Scotland's universities are so excellent, and yet the research and innovation base that surrounds them is not so great. And I would link it to your comment, the data is hard to access. For those of us who've tried, and I have historically tried, you can dig in and pull out some very interesting data from the Treasury with great effort. And what you learn is that the research investment is not just competitive grants, which Scotland's universities are excellent at and do relatively well, but it's in this thing called infrastructure. And infrastructure investment is not competitively assigned. Now that ranges from just simply the EPSRC and other such bodies just simply delivering money to centres. So NERC is a good example, the Natural Environmental Research Council. All the headquarters of the 6 centres are outside of Scotland. But if you look at Scotland's blue economy and other related features, you'd wonder why that was the case. That's one concrete example. But there are more specific things. Governments then spend money that follows these infrastructure investments. So if you partition up, you discover that the Golden Triangle, which is of course co-located with the centres of power, gets essentially 1% of government investment in research and innovation in the UK. And its overall performance is 3%, which is this usual 2-to-1 ratio, because business happily co-locates next to these institutes, which serve as a nice buffer as one tries to translate university research and innovation into the business landscape. So I think that there's interesting data that can be accessed, but it would be good to have more transparency around it on that issue. And that comes back to the point raised in the report, and again, this is to quote you, that the need for strong, independent institutions which command respect, and again, hard evidence of what works. So I'd like to draw attention to the fact that most countries have scientific bodies, national academies, which can provide serious input, independent, outside of government, to the functioning of all sorts of things. But in fact, I think Scotland is in a relatively unique position in that regard. Because if you take the Royal Society of London, this is actually an infrastructure invested organisation. They command 100+ million from the government, which supports, of course, great studies of any question the government might seek advice on. But the Royal Society of Edinburgh does not command that type of infrastructure investment, neither does the Royal Society of Wales. So again, I think it is important to imagine scenarios where we had academies which were infrastructure invested. And that would, of course, take it outside of the political court too. It would just be naturally embedded. And then they would be bodies that could perhaps command not just respect and authority, but they have the assets and the ability to probe questions of interest to the peoples of that particular country. So that's my 2 points.
Yeah, I mean, just so on the, I mean, I think I agree wholeheartedly with your comments there about, the value added in tourism. That comes back to my point about, how do you get growth in a sector like tourism, and high value is one way you do that. I think the point about universities and, students going to university is really well made. I think if you look, I don't know if the statistics in the report, but if you look, there's a great stat that in the EU, if you go to the NUTS regions of the EU, of which Scotland is part of it, we're third in all of Europe in terms of having the highest proportion of graduates for our working age population. So begs the question, well, we should then therefore have, or is it that automatically follow that we then have we have the third best skilled workforce in the economy and in the EU, and we probably don't. So there's something in there, exactly your point about not just giving people degrees for the sake of giving degrees, but actually then how do we match the skills and actually giving the people the right qualifications that we need for a modern economy. And I think one of the big challenges, I think, to universities in the next few years will be is that I think students will start to have a different view about how they're educated and the choices that are to them. So if AI is going to mean that we're all going to have 5 or 6 jobs in our lifetime, and the job that we start just now is not going to be there in 3 or 4 years, why would you study for 4 years at university for a degree and a qualification that may be redundant in 3 or 4 years, when you could come into a place like this, get some skills and become much more innovative there? And I think that one of the challenges for our higher and further education system over the long term will be fleet of foot that can then get around this idea that actually people are going to want to be educated in a different way. I mean, your point about innovation, etc., again, is relative to disagree with that. I mean, I would probably broaden that out to, again, a wider point about that. I think universities are beginning to increasingly move to think about how they, rather than just we do academic research and we teach students and that's what we do, to have a wider view about what their economic footprint is in with society and within the local economy.
The key point was that without these infrastructure investments, these middlemen, so to speak, it's hard to make that transition to the business sector.
And I think I would open up all those to things like, we talk a lot about policy, what can policy do there, but we've got organisations like the NHS, which is the largest employer in Scotland, spends a lot of money. Again, how do we use that as a way to try and generate and boost research and boost activity? So what new ideas can we do to try and get that infrastructure in the broadest sense possible?
Matthew, you can start the move backwards up that side.
This is a really interesting conversation, but somewhat abstract for the daily newspapers. In box 3, you, having used the Scottish Policy Foundation economic model in anger for the first time, have concluded that a 1% increase in total factor productivity is worth 2.3 billion to the Scottish GDP. What does 2.3 billion mean to the man and woman in the street? How much more tax would we have to spend on our welfare?
Someone else in that? Yes. First hand was the gentleman just on the end of this row on the centre aisle.
Okay, thank you very much. I was struck by a quick look in the document at some of the case studies of places like sort of Sweden and Australia, where there was, if not deregulation, a move away from centralisation and sort of the cold hand of government. And bearing in mind the percentage of people who in public sector employment in Scotland, and going back, I mean, I'm a director of an NHS board and very aware of the opportunities there might be in research, development, innovation in these organisations, but at the moment they're just struggling to stop water coming through the dike. Did you draw any kind of conclusions at all about whether there were structural issues in Scotland which might get in the way of improving productivity?
Do you want to start on the tax?
So one of the, I guess, the big new developments that we've seen in Scotland, which might actually, there was a question about how do we get this debate to resonate and actually gain some traction. And I think one of the big fundamental change that the debate in Scotland will now be driven by is the fact that this debate about economic growth and productivity is no longer just about economics, but it's about tax take and revenues and ultimately the public services, etc., that we depend on. So if you look at our modelling, for example, for when you get the boost in GDP, or what we do is we recycle all these benefits back into higher government expenditure, so you get higher government expenditure over time, and you recycle that and you grow that and you boost that. So one of the key goals of boosting productivity is not just to boost productivity for productivity's sake, but it's then to be able to get more tax taken, which in turn lets you spend more money in public services, etc. And the really interesting thing about productivity is that because essentially that it's essentially pure profit, then the tax take on something like productivity gains is exceptionally high. So even if in a scenario like this, when you play around with it, if you're getting 20% of that growth in productivity back recycled into government expenditure, there's £400 million back into public expenditure than it otherwise would have been. And the more and more that you can do that, the more and more you can get faster wage growth and faster productivity, then ultimately that's when you get higher investment in public services, which I guess is going to be increasingly important when you've got an ageing population.
Would either of you two like to make a comment about the structural issues around the gentleman's question at the back?
Just a reflection, if you allow me, something of that sort for this kind of issue, which is linked to what the previous questioner, I think, was driving at, which is how do you make any of this intelligible when you're not an economist or used to thinking in these things, in these terms. 1% of national wealth doesn't sound like much because it's just 1%, but that's because people don't know what the country is worth. And in fact, we probably don't really know what the country is worth. The problem becomes even more acute at the level of cities. And here I would roughly stand on the record that there isn't a mayor in the world who knows how much money is being spent by the public sector from all sources within his jurisdiction, because that's far greater than the budget that is actually administered by the city. Now, this could be taken to be an argument for centralized treasury control, but I think that's the wrong way to look at it. And in fact, it's in the logic of subsidiarity and decentralization. The problem is that the economies that really matter at the urban or subnational level are porous. They are very difficult. They're very difficult to measure, but that's where the voters live. And that's the problem is translating some of what we're talking about into things that people see and do and have to put up with every single day. And it's making this connection in language, in images, that is difficult for people in policy. And they, quite frankly, need help. You know, there are people, professional people who can do this. But it's not straightforward. One early lesson I got in this was in the early 1990s, the city of Seattle, King County, the state of Washington, wanted to undertake a major series of public sector investments, transport, environment, and the whole thing. They needed budget approval and bonding approval, so they had to go to the polls. It meant that the budget director and other government officials had to go into neighborhoods and actually speak to constituents every single night of the week until they had the election. And they were, the whole problem was to try to find a way of saying, well, what would you really care about? What would you like to see the money spent upon? And what worked in Seattle, it turned out to be fish, because of where they are and their whole culture of salmon and so on. If you could restore things related to that kind of environment, people would go for it. But that obviously isn't going to work in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
I was just going to mention the thing about sort of communicating and so on. It's one of the reasons I found the Australian case study so interesting was the way that the reform was negotiated, not just across political parties, business and trade unions, but also communicated with the public. I didn't really kind of realise until I left Australia that there's actually a higher level of economic literacy. It just because those conversations had been had over a number of years, we kind of sort of reflect this. There's a kind of whole section on communicating on the need for reform and. Sort of then Prime Minister Paul Keating would go on the radio, it says here, and perhaps the most memorable of the appearances, he warned in 1986 that if the economy was not reformed, then Australia is basically done for and would risk becoming a banana republic. And everybody remembers that. It's sort of a complete genius, as were other people around at the time negotiating reform, in explaining why it was really important and what kind of difference it would make to people's lives if they didn't do this, and what the prize would be if they did do it. And I agree, the communication is generally really bad, so I think that's something we could definitely learn from.
Okay, I'll do a bit of, so one there and one there, and then we'll work backwards in the room next time, if there's time. It's almost with you, David.
I don't know if this is a sensible question or not, actually. I want to think about scale. And, when we talk, Scotland isn't a homogeneous country. You gave an example in what it was a community near Seattle where they went out and made the case for whatever, and they communicated locally with that. What is the scale at which, is it all scales in Scotland that productivity should be tackled? Or could we collectively imagine a culture change which had small scales emerging, collectively creating an increase in productivity? So my question is about scale and where it actually really happens. I don't know if that's a sensible question or not. That's it.
And I didn't get the precise location of that. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. I'm Kenny Richmond from Scottish Enterprise, and maybe a couple of thoughts from the perspective of an organisation that supports businesses to try and improve their productivity. I think from years of experience and evaluations, we kind of know what works, I think. But a key challenge we find is getting the number of businesses coming through who have the ambition or the skills or the ability to take forward some of the productivity growth initiatives and programs. So we've got a good idea of what works, but it's really a case of how do we get more businesses within the business base adopting the characteristics that we know boost productivity.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, this question of scale. To me, what is, looking at Scotland, the tensions between the different parts of Scotland, the distances that are involved, which are frictional, the fact that half the population is in the central belt, which is congested and could certainly use a lot of productivity boosting infrastructure investment, but it won't work politically if it means that the rest of the country gets starved, underfunded. So at what scale do decisions have to be made, and what are the trade-offs? And then even within, as we've seen over arguments about, for example, tramways to airports, where there are competitive pressures from different councils. So I'm somewhat familiar with the problems. Now, what I'm going to tell you is not part of an answer that works for Scotland, but an insight that I've had basically from my experience living in the United States for decades, and some familiarity with other countries that come out of this 17th century English constitutional framework. It becomes very, very difficult to change local administrative boundaries. I don't know why, but it seems to me that it's not been simple. I now live in Saint-Mande-France, on the edge of Paris, in the 94th department. Greater Paris is a region. It is undergoing massive administrative reform to get a structure which will be coherent with the economic size and challenges of the region, and where decisions can be taken that dilute the tendency of local governments to steal the sheets, pull them closer. Now, this is likely to mean that there will be municipal mergers. There will be consolidation at the intermediate level. It's all being done pretty fast, like 4 or 5 years. There are obviously left-right tensions, but somewhere there is a conversation that's going on. It didn't start, however, with Macron. And this is a point about reform. It started in Lyon in 2012. The simple reason that Lyon, if any of you know it, the city and the department are coterminous by chance. So administrative reorganization was feasible without crossing borders with other units. And it worked. It worked. In fact, the mayor of Lyon at that time became the Minister of Interior in Macron's administration. But the fact that it worked was then used by another government, later on, intermediate, first with Sarkozy, who didn't carry it out, and then with Hollande, who did. Said, let's do this nationally where we can, even if it means tackling special interests, local prejudices, and so on at the district level. But the story I want to tell you is the story of the first success. Without that first success, this national reform process, which is going to culminate in a few years, would not have been possible. And it's all being done in what? Less than a generation. In the United States, inconceivable. Let me tell you, changing one single boundary between two adjacent towns requires going to the voters, ballots, and all the rest of it. Cannot be done.
Yeah, I mean, on the on the point about what works, I think where I would disagree to an extent is that I think that if you look at Scottish economic policy over the last 20 years, what we have is really high-level targets and amazing evaluation of individual projects. It's the bit in the middle that I think is completely missing. So it's you can have a project which shows we stick 5 million quid into these 50 companies, do we get higher exports? Yes. For me, that's the wrong question. The wrong question is, do we genuinely know why we have an export problem in Scotland, and why? What can we do across? And what happens if we shift the money? So let's suppose we get rid of 200 million of the small business bonus and we give 200 million to Scottish enterprise. Is that a better use of 200 million pounds, or is it a worse use of 200 million pounds? The problem is we don't know, and I think until we do know that, then that's where I think I disagree. I genuinely don't think we know what works.
Okay, I think we are about to run out of time, so can I just repeat my thanks to two of our major funders, the Scottish Policy Foundation and Baillie Gifford, because this work absolutely would not have been possible without their financial support. And can I thank our three commentators for their willingness to field such a wide range of questions and engage so thoroughly with the issues raised. And then I know Jane Frances also has some thanks which she wishes to make.
Yes, this is the last thing before wine. And some of this is for the recording, because there were some people who couldn't be here tonight who were very involved in making this happen. So Anne, Anna and Becca. Brodie Viney, who worked for me in Melbourne for 1 week 7 years ago. And then when 6 weeks ago I tracked him down and I phoned him and I said, can you do 2 days work for me next week? And he said yes, and did an excellent job. Martin McCluskey, who's sitting here right in the front row, has been fantastic throughout. Graeme Roy and Robert Zymek, between them, kept us on the economic straight and narrow. Robert Zymek, sometimes in the middle of the night was when drafts would come through. So if you ever need something produced overnight, Dr. Zymek's your man. We have been joking through this process that this project has been plagued by bad luck. Everything that could have gone wrong did. Everybody had completely incompatible holiday dates. One of us got stuck in Mexico because of snow in Manchester. That was the story, apparently. Our original launch date clashed with something else and had to be moved. Even to the point where a couple of days ago I got a phone call saying that the room where our upcoming trustee meeting is taking place, the ceiling had fallen in. So I don't know what was going to be next, but there was one thing that we had to be lucky with, which was that the person that did the bulk of the work, of the research that's in this report, is actually the person who's been ticking off your names as you've been coming in. He had to run up to Sainsbury's to get the water bottles, and he's been handing around the microphone. He's a young economist. What was I saying about bad luck? See, Mark, I can't even get your name out. He's a young economist called Mark Mitchell, and he's been fantastic from start to finish, and he's worked his socks off, and so he's who my last thank you is going to.